I hope this works, the sound here, but I just want to play a clip for Sean Griffin. So I don't agree with Sean Griffin on several things, but I think there's several things that he gets right that most Christians don't get right regarding uh, the law. Okay, but I don't think you get to include all the. I don't. He says all kinds of things I have a problem with. Sean does, but I don't. But there are things he says that are right. And Solberg, I'm not sure who I'm closer to be honest. Solberg has criticized my views. I think the food laws are binding. I think we're supposed to keep the food laws. Um, I think sin is transgression of the law, and Jesus came to destroy sin in the flesh. I just think you can't say the entire law of Moses is meant to go over because of what Paul wrote. It's clearly not the case. Uh, if you think about it logically, the quote unquote historically known as the ceremonial law, which is a distinction worth making, even if you say it's the reason people call it the law of Moses is to make that differentiation historically. If you disagree with their distinctions, that's fine. Make a case for that. But stop pretending like there's no distinction between the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and the laws they received through Moses by God, which was the law of God, but also the law of Moses, because Moses gave them the covenant. That covenant is not identical in the new covenant. And no, Ephesians 2 or 4 or whatever it is, he abolished in his flesh the commandments contained in ordinances. Sorry, ordinances, although can be used for Roman ordinances or added ordinances or Takanot or added Pharisee law, which Jesus certainly rebuked them for. And I agree. Jesus wasn't doing away with the food laws when he said, it's not what goes into a man that, he was saying that the Gentiles aren't unclean anymore, even though that they've been eating unclean food, which is really more of an issue of like, it's not like God hates that you eat unclean food. I would guess it's something more like it's not good for you and it's not good for your body. Okay. And the Jews thought Gentiles were just like disgusting because of they ate unclean food and they were like looking down on them in such a way that wasn't good. But the food laws themselves, that's the point of those things with Peter. If Jesus had made all foods clean and in the way that they used to be unclean, it seems to me, Peter wouldn't have had that reaction when he got the vision because he would have known Jesus said all foods are clean now. So he at least wouldn't have he may still be eating kosher because he's used to it. And so he might as well, right? So what's the problem there? That they were calling people unclean. He was separating himself from the Gentiles because the Jews thought they were gross, but they're not gross. They're image bearers. So if you look at it that way, and that was wrong towards the Gentiles, and he's saying, look, you're using this to think bad of people or down on people, but the law of God was actually for their benefit. It's good for them. It's not just ceremonial, the food. Obviously, eating things that eat poop for a living are not suddenly magically good now to eat poop. And now you can eat that. They say you are what you eat. So like, if you understand the intention of God, well, he used to be mean and not let them eat things that people like to eat just for no apparent reason at all, just because it's ceremonial. Like, hey, I want you to burn your eyebrows off every 3rd month because I want you to be my special people. And then later on, and if you don't do it, I'm going to punish you. But now that's not, that was never good for you, but you had to do it or you're in big trouble. It's like, no, I don't think so. That doesn't make sense to me. You have to just understand, like, condemning people who don't know better, that's wrong. So again, I'm for the food laws. I'm for, because what God says is good, unless so there is a distinction to be made between the old covenant and the law in Christ. But I don't agree with Solberg's delineation of it, but I also don't believe with this guy's delineation of it, Sean Griffin. Because I've been studying the church fathers, I think it's worthwhile. I've already tried to show Sean, he doesn't care, I'm a small channel anyway, that I can prove easily that the book of Jubilees claims to make a prophecy about them using the calendar wrong in Israel. We know how they kept the calendar in Israel, and it's obvious to see that they're part of those sects that separated themselves that went to these books. They didn't use a 364-day a year calendar. And them in that book of Jubilees and in Enoch that claims that, they give a prophecy that they won't keep the festivals on the right days. and they'll be real. That's really bad, and so it won't count. Well, if that's true, then Jesus didn't die on Passover. If that prophecy was true, and it's an ancient book, that means because they didn't keep it 364 days per year. If they did, the reality is they would have actually not been able to do the Passover because over several decades or century, or at least a century maybe, they wouldn't have had Passover lambs available, let alone crops in the right season if they were following the calendar that the book of Jubilees insists is correct. And it's a but if anybody actually followed it and kept to 364 days every year, it would be they wouldn't work. So it's false. We know that that's false. So I just want to point out this claim he makes here about Irenaeus, and I've seen him do it before, and a bunch of people from his channel came to me trying to argue that the early church fathers were for the law of Moses being active in the new covenant. The New Testament says the law of Moses was a yoke of bondage in comparison to the new covenant. The things they had to do to come near to God that are no longer necessary to come near to God, like diverse washings and cardinal ordinances, which were imposed on them until the time of Reformation. That's not talking about tokenote. It's talking about if you go to the context of chapter 9, it's talking about how the earthly temple is done away with in the priesthood of Jesus. And it starts by talking about they had divine ordinances, heavenly, that God imposed these ordinances in the temple for them. And then it talks about the temple, and then it says these were temporary until the time of Reformation. And there were diverse washings in the King James carnal ordinances, meaning things they had to do. And he speaks of them as what? Not being sufficient in the way Jesus is. It's a contrast. And they're done away with. The time of Reformation is now, because that which is old is passing away, and it's talking about the covenant, and then it compares it to the ministry of Jesus in the heavenly sanctuary. And so, yes, there were parts of Moses' law that are not passed into the new covenant, and it's because people don't acknowledge this that they mess everything up. Because when everyone, to the ones who want to take the whole law of Moses and bring it into the new covenant, to the people who want to claim that whenever it's talking about the law, it's talking about the whole law of Moses, and they want to get rid of everything. And then the guys that want to bring everything over, they're both wrong. It's not everything. There are distinctions, whether you like it or not. And that's what confuses everybody. They take a side on that, and it's false. The use of ordinance, yes, can be used for Roman decrees, but you don't get to do the illegitimate totalities transfer and anywhere that word dogmasin or whatever is used, say, because the majority of texts they're used to speak of decrees of men, that it's never used in the context of God's law. But it is. They're commandments contained in ordinances he abolished. Why? Because they represented him. That's what Colossians 2 is saying. He nailed to the cross the things that was dealing with their sins and that are being replaced by the one offering of Jesus. And to bring the Gentiles back to Yahweh, it doesn't require a temple. Okay. So Hebrews 9, Ephesians, commandments contained in ordinances he abolished in his flesh, meaning his body, which was the offering on the cross, which was what was nailed to the cross. The handwriting of ordinances that was against us, yes, is the debt of sin, and the system of law used to deal with the sin that was temporary via, see the context of the beginning of Hebrews 9 and how it ends. Okay. And that's in the context of the new covenant, Jeremiah 31 being fulfilled. It is fulfilled. It's been inaugurated. It'll be fully. And yes, the knowledge of Yahweh has gone, the God of the Hebrew has been spread by the knowledge of Jesus, who is God, by the way, because he's equal with the Father. You've seen me, you've seen the Father. The knowledge of Yahweh, the knowledge of the God of the Bible has gone around the world because of the new covenant. So yes, Jeremiah 31 is largely fulfilled, not fully realized. If you deny that, then you're saying essentially the promise that his church wouldn't fail. However you look at that, I'm not a Catholic. I think there's error in the church from way early on in all sorts of ways, but I don't think everybody's lost. They still learned about Yahweh through learning about Jesus. They still served God the best they could with where they were at, according to their circumstances. And So, yeah, people do know the Lord, just not fully yet. So, but here's an error, and I've seen them do this before with Irenaeus. Irenaeus did not think that the law of Moses was applicable in the new covenant. And I'll prove it from the documents.
That's weird. All right, let's try this. This is all live and in real time, guys. I'm sorry. Okay, let's just do this.
Is it crackling? So I'll just tell you, it's a real. Someone can check on this. I hope he watches this. He references from to kind of, because Solberg makes a distinction. I don't agree with Solberg's distinctions, but as far as the distinction of the law, what the early church fathers said, they largely sounded like what I would say. What, they may not have kept the Sabbath, but I'll show you how they do a distinction. Sean references this. I know people who watch him have referenced it and try to bring it up to me, but I've actually read this work. So when you go to book 3 of Irenaeus Against Heresies, it's chapter 12, and then go to the section 12. This is what Sean quoted. I'll read it to you. And I mean, people can, there's certain things about this you can argue about what he's saying. But I'll show you something very particular that shows that he doesn't agree with Sean's perspective. I don't agree with either of these people, but I want to be honest. Like, this is just factual. So he quotes this: "For all those who are of a perverse mind," Irenaeus is in like 130 AD to just past 200, and he was taught by Polycarp, and Polycarp knew John, the Apostle John. So for all those who he was combating Gnosticism in this work that was permeating into the church or into the Christianized world with Platonism. For all those who are of a perverse mind, having been set against the Mosaic legislation, wow, judging it to be dissimilar and contrary to the doctrine of the gospel, have not applied themselves to investigate the cause of the difference of each covenant. Now, that last part there is probably key to what he's trying to say, but it kind of sounds like he's saying you could use this against somebody who's saying the Mosaic law doesn't come into the new covenant in full form. This is complicated. It was an issue from the very beginning. They have been deserted by the paternal love and puffed up by Satan, being brought over to the doctrine of Simon Magus. They have apostatized in their opinions from him who is God, and imagine that they have themselves discovered more than the apostles by finding out another God, and maintained that the apostles preach the gospel still somewhat under the influence of Jewish opinions, but that they themselves are purer in doctrine and more intelligent than the apostles. Okay. And if you keep reading, that's where he left off. Okay. He's using this to say that the Mosaic law, like he teaches, that apparently Irenaeus is saying that he's kind of implying, right? Not at all what Irenaeus is saying. This is what he goes on to say. He goes on to how he's defending against Marcion, of course, who was antinomian, by the way. He only accepted some of Paul. He had like the first sort of pseudo canon where he rejected like Peter and Paul and James and the book of Hebrews and the Gospels, except for, forget one of them, maybe something like that. Okay, but this is most of what he says. So he goes on to describe the error of these Gnostics who were antinomian, but the problem was they were separating the Old Testament God from the New Testament God, saying there were two gods, like, or there was an eternal good and evil God, or that God determines all evil, things like that. The God from the Old Testament that Jesus saved us from. They're like Calvinism, only Calvinism would say Jesus isn't saving us from that Old Testament God. It's the real God. It's just he is that way. I'm kind of joking. Okay, but this is how this section ends. And in the course of, this is Irenaeus speaking, a few sentences later, okay, and in the course of this work, I shall touch upon the cause of the difference of the covenants, on the one hand, and on the other hand of their unity and their harmony. That's how he ends this section. that Sean quoted the first part, which I just requoted. And then now I'm telling you how he ends this section after he describes the Gnostics. Okay. Now, this is book 3, chapter 12. In the next book of Irenaeus, book 4, okay. Let me see. I clicked off of it. Hold on. In book 4, chapter 16, okay, listen to this. This is him doing what he said at the end of that section that he would do later. And this is just at least some of what he does later to answer that question. This is book 4, chapter 16, section 4. Okay. Therefore, does the scripture say, these words the Lord spoke to all the assembly of the children of Israel in the mount, and he added no more. Again, this is the same author, same against heresies. The next book, okay. For, as I have already observed, he stood in need of nothing from man, speaking of God. Irenaeus speaking about God's need towards man. And again, Moses says, and now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you, but to fear the Lord your God and walk in all his ways, and to love him and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Now these things did indeed make man glorious by supplying what was wanting to him, namely the friendship with God. But they profited God nothing, for God did not at all stand in need of man's love. For the glory of God was wanting to man, which he could obtain in no other way than by serving God. And therefore Moses says to them again, choose life that you may live, and your seed to love the Lord your God, to hear his voice and cleave unto him, for this is your life. Moses says to them again, choose life and be the length of your days. Now listen. Speaking of the old covenant through Moses, quoting Deuteronomy, preparing man for this life, the Lord himself did speak in his own person to all alike the words of the Decalogue, and therefore, in like manner, do they remain permanently with us, receiving by means of his advent in the flesh, that means the incarnation. So, those things which God did speak in the Decalogue to all alike, mankind, in like manner, therefore, do they, the Decalogue, remain permanently with us, receiving by means of his advent in the flesh, extension and increase, not abrogation. The laws of bondage, however, were one by one promulgated to the people by Moses, suited for their instruction or for their punishment. So yeah, he stood for the moral law, basically, what became to be known as the moral law. And what he's saying in book 3 is that he's fighting people who are making a disunity between the Father and the Son. They were saying that the Son is that he's not redeeming the flesh. The Old Testament God who created us is bad. He's not like this Jesus. And they're saying, no, the Jewish God is the right God in the scriptures. Jesus is, because of what Jesus said and taught. They were like arguing out that was false. Like that's why they didn't accept some of the texts, like John 5, for instance, right? So, Jesus came with the commandments, but Irenaeus isn't saying, he's using that because they're saying the God of the old covenant and Jesus aren't the same God, right? That's why he refers to what they say, that God who gave the Mosaic covenant is a different God. And so when he refers to that, he's saying they're wrong about that because of that. They think that. He's not saying the covenants, everything comes over in the law of Moses. He's speaking of the perversion of those who make Jesus and the Old Testament God different gods. How do I know that? Because the last comment he made that Sean didn't quote, he just quoted the part that sounds good to his position. He actually tells you, Now, as far as the similarities, and you get a hint of it in that first sentence, what he said. It kind of sounds like he's totally for the law of Moses coming over. But then he says, what did he say? I forget. He said, he says, so I would argue that what I just read is him partially, in part at least, describing. And I've read this from other people too. Like they kind of said the Decalogue because they're thinking of like how much it's quoted by the apostles in the epistles. And Paul references them. James references them. Jesus always referenced the Ten Commandments. Jesus interprets them plainly in the Sermon on the Mount. When he's rebuking the Pharisees, he's actually referring to the Ten Commandments. It's like that's what's always referenced. Not just that, but mostly. And so, and they knew that we were now the temple of God, receiving the Holy Spirit, that the temple is done away with. Like you can't really say they were just, they were anti-Jewish. I think they giving up the Sabbath, which happened not right away, is partly due to anti-Semitism, but it's not this part of it. The part of the Mosaic law, like where you have to go to the temple, there's no evidence that they were teaching that in the early church. They certainly weren't. And if that were true, and you were supposed to have to do the festivals, well, then there'd have to be a set up worldwide way of dealing with the sighting of the moon. Last I checked, that nobody's really figured that out yet. All the Hebrew roots people disagree, and there's no unifying sort of body. Well, you'd sure think that if we were supposed to, as in it was a sin if we didn't, and God intended for everybody to do it, that certainly somebody would have held a way to keep the Hebrew calendar for a worldwide thing. It makes sense if all the worship in the Old Covenant is going around a temple in a geographical region for the most part, right? And the priesthood is there in the temple. Obviously you cite it from where the temple is, Jerusalem. And that sets the calendar for the first day of the month. And then you count the days. But what if you live in China, it's worldwide, and there's no phones and planes or way to communicate? How would that even work? They wouldn't be doing it on the same day. In a very, very different, the years would be different. There would have to be a unified head of the church that sighted the moon worldwide for the body, because otherwise there'd be no unity in it. It's different some people have Sabbath on a different day, but it's like it's like sweeping across the earth, and everybody has a 7-day week, and no one can change that. The Sabbath is different. But sighting of the moon and counting days, that's weird. It doesn't really make sense to me. It doesn't seem like it was set up, but it does seem like the week was made from the very beginning to be, and every single nation across the world has the same 7-day week now, and pretty much for the most part has too, for most of history. Everybody knows what day the Sabbath is. And Jesus was once, like, everything's circled around the sacrifices that were pointing to Christ and the things God did for them, like when the angel of death passed over. But all those things are like looking to what Jesus did and is going to do. Why would you need, that's why they would have a temple on earth. The Gentiles weren't let in the same way that the Jews had access. There was a separation which Jesus brought down. It says in the New Testament, he brought down the wall of separation. The temple curtain did rip up the middle by God's hand, exposing the most holy place on earth. The temple did get destroyed on earth. The book of Hebrews does exist. So I'm just saying, man, like, to pretend like you're telling everybody they have to, because it says in Ezekiel 38 or whatever about everybody's going to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Everyone who doesn't come to Jerusalem will not get rain. God, in the book of Revelation, he takes all the different names of the different nations that went against his people in the Old Covenant and mentions it in the book of Revelation. Do we have to believe that the city of Babylon will be a literal city that comes back? Or is that a reference to the way that these people opposed God in the past, and he's using that situation as an example for like the fuller like spiritual rebellion going on behind the scenes and in the hearts of men that God is trying to pull to him. Do they need to like eat a lamb on a certain day, or like they're not following God? Like that's not a moral thing. Like that was a thing that teach them to point them to Jesus, and the thing that and it didn't exist before they left Egypt. The Passover starts because of what happened in Egypt. So it's not eternal. The Passover is not eternal. Sorry. God's character is immutable and eternal, and how that's expressed to us to things how we should be is eternal, obviously, and always moral. But the Passover didn't exist before the event, which the Bible says this is why you tell your kids to do this, because of what God did when he took us out of Egypt and the angel of death passed over, except we put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. Now we need the blood. If we don't have the blood applied to us, when the angel of death comes in the judgment, you'll die. It's like the firstborn son, but God provided is like a substitute. It's like, that's the point of the Passover, to point to Jesus. And then he dies on Passover, and then he's raised on the first fruits, and he's called the first fruits of them that slept. He's like those who are his at his coming. We follow after him in that way. Telling people they have to keep the Passover or they're sinning, I think is a mistake. I don't think if you want to keep it, go ahead. But I think Solberg's right on that. So there are the distinctions. I think the Sabbath, it's like, look, the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. It's established in Eden for mankind. Jesus says he's Lord of it. So like, it doesn't make sense to say, well, keep them as best as you can. Okay. Should I keep sacrifices as best as I can without a temple too? We could do sacrifices. You think they're coming back? People have been talking about this. Like, I don't think so, man. Seems there's like in heaven, like everyone's going to be immortal and they're not going to sin anymore. So why would they do sacrifices? And by the way, in heaven, you don't even go to heaven when you die, first off. But if the millennium's on earth and it's talking about people having to do the sacrifices in the millennium, newsflash, when Jesus returns next, according to the New Testament, he shows up and he executes the separation, and the people that are lost are set aside for the final judgment. They're dead, of course. He kills the Antichrist. Matthew 13, Matthew 25, Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13, the greetings in 2nd and 1st Thessalonians, the warning of Peter's epistle, the second. They're going to be eating and drinking, right? Jesus said, giving marriage, and then the flood takes them away. That's the wicked. He sends forth his angels and they gather out everything that practices lawlessness and offends. That's his next coming. Matthew 25, all the parables of Matthew 25 out of Matthew 24. The flood will take them away. Then Peter uses that in 2 Peter 3. They're going to say, where's the promise of his coming? They won't think he's coming, but they will see it, and every eye will see him, and the tribes of the earth will mourn. And there'll be a group that says, this is our God. We have waited for him. He'll save us. And then other people will hide us. They'll hide in the clefts of the rock, and they'll say, hide us from him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And he's coming, and his reward is with him to give to every man according to his works. And all those whose names are not written in the Lamb's book of life from the foundation of the world were worshiping the beast, who's been given the ability to have power over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship the beast, except those whose names are written in the book of life. Jesus shows up, and if those days weren't short, no flesh should be alive, and destroys the Antichrist with the brightness of his coming and the breath of his mouth. And when the Lord descends from heaven with a shout and the voice of the archangel, the dead in Christ will rise first, and all the saints who are alive and remain won't precede them, but in the twinkling of an eye they'll be changed, and they'll all be gathered together to meet the Lord in the air. What millennium? Everybody who's a saint, everyone who's saved when Jesus executes the judgment, will have an immortal body and won't sin anymore. And God said there won't be any more death. So why would there be animal death with sacrifices on? When Jesus returns, the millennium begins. When the millennium begins, everyone's been separated, including all the lost, because they were worshiping the beast. Everyone who wasn't worshiping the beast gets changed with all the saints of all time who are resurrected, and they're taken to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Where is this millennium where they're doing animal sacrifices because people are still sinning? There are no sinners at that time. When Jesus comes back, there is no more sinners ever, except for when he raises the lost at the end of the 1,000 years so that they can demonstrate their rebellion and try to attack the city. And then he destroys them with fire that comes down out of heaven. So the only living sinners that will be a very temporary moment to execute final destruction of the wicked and Satan at the end of the 1,000 years. But there's no sinners besides that event, which is a judgment when Christ returns. There can't be a millennium, and there's no more death after that. This is why there's just the same thing with if everything in the law of Moses was eternal. You're like saying they had sacrifices for sins before there was sin in the world. God's law, eternal law, had sacrifices for sins. Jesus is the one sacrifice for all, is still doing sacrifices in heaven. No, sorry, definitely wrong. The reason Solberg is right about the interpretation of certain prophecies is because when those prophecies were written about God's people, he used prophetically the language of the different feasts and the aspect of what it's pointing to recognize the Messiah. So when it talks about those who don't tabernacle, he'll make it no rain con. Yeah, those who haven't made their home with what God did in Jerusalem through Jesus, people who don't make themselves, don't bring themselves to God, won't get the latter rain. You could argue that, or won't get the sustenance from heaven. And it's just couched in the terms prior to the new covenant and the mystery of godliness being revealed in the way God brought salvation through Jesus. Obviously, because that was a secret until Jesus came, the language that the prophet's going to use in the old covenant before Jesus shows up, he's going to use it by using the terms of their festivals, which were a shadow of what Jesus would do. So we have to read it just like the New Testament writers have a Christological, typological, not allegorical interpretation of Old Testament passages. Jesus does this, Paul does it, and they interpret and give us so that's why I say Hebrew roots people are often coming from a dispensational interpretive method, which is a sort of literalism. And they're incensed that someone could possibly suggest, well, hello, Jesus said, your temple I leave to you desolate. Jesus said, the day is coming when those who worship me will not do it at Jerusalem, but in spirit and in truth. He's ascended into the heavenly temple. We don't need an earthly temple. We don't need animal sacrifices. We need obedient, faithful, loving relationship and repentance. Doesn't require everything from the Old Testament, or we have to throw the whole law out. That's a fallacy. It's false. It's fake. It's not true. We should get our interpretive method from the New Testament authors themselves, who did not interpret it literally. And there's several ways we can look at that, but you can watch my videos on prophetic interpretation. Some of them are difficult. Some of them may be conditional. I would argue that's what it's talking about. The first feasts were Jesus' first coming, and the last feasts are pointing to something about the second coming, which is the judgment that God's going to live with man and that Jesus is coming back. And the first three were he came once for sin, and he'll come a second time unto salvation for those who are waiting for him. Yeah, Messianic Judaism. Look, I have sympathy for both sides, and I agree largely with these guys who I would just say that Messianic Judaism, I like a lot of what I'll listen to their sermons and stuff, and I'll listen to a lot of different sermons, but in a way, like Messianic Judaism comes at it from a kind of and everybody's different, but like it really irritates me when they're like, oh, the Sabbath doesn't matter. I'm like, dude, what, you're going to have a Gentile church and a Jewish church? Like they usually don't like Adventists. And Adventists, some of them can be sort of like anti-Jewish or whatever. That's more of a cultural thing. But like we are for the Sabbath. We're for I would say at least that it's like the church is Jewish. It's a Jewish church. So I always was so confused when like these dispensationalists would say I'm replacement theology, and I'm like going, what are you talking about? Like I think we're supposed to keep the Sabbath, and like Jesus established the church with Jews. Like, why are you saying why am I replacement theology? And I didn't get it for the longest time, and I realized because of my prophecy, the way we interpret prophecy is being a larger picture. It's not just, they think it's talking about the Jews. So they think like other churches were denying that God has a plan for the Jews. Well, you've denied the plan that God's executed for the Jews when he started the church with some of them in the first century. That is their salvation. So it's like your replacement theology, saying the church is like for Gentiles. It's like, it's for Gentiles, but it's firstly for Jews. They established it. All the people who established the churches were Jews in the first century, and the headquarters was in Jerusalem. And the guy who appointed it is a Jew, and all his disciples were, and all the first churches were. For the Gentiles to come in, we're grafted in. Don't call me replacement theology, you retard. You're replacement theology. That's just like, you're Islamophobic. Nobody wants to be Islamophobic now, do you? Don't be replacement theology. Come on, let me sucker you into my bad interpretation of the Bible by making you feel like you're racist if you don't accept it. That's exactly like when people start throwing around Islamophobia. It's just trash. It's total manipulation. And what does that tell me? It tells me your interpretation is wrong, and that you want to distort the good arguments by making people think they're racist to try to trick them into your view. It's pathetic. Don't you dare. But then on the other hand, a lot of church history is anti-Semitic. That has nothing to do with wanting to steal their birthright or something. Like the text, I don't know. I don't like talking about it because people get offended or whatever. It's just like, there's supposed to be a unified church, Jew and Gentile. And if you're going to say like, God, all those things are talking about the Jews and the Jewish temple coming back. Hello, the new covenant that doesn't need a temple when you're arguing with other Gentile Christians and you're trying to say keeping the law, which defines sin, is like trying to bring back the temple, which Jesus did away with because he's the one sacrifice for all. They'll argue that. And then they argue he's going to bring back the temple for the Jews, as if the thing they're falsely arguing against my view about with the temple, which I actually agree with, that Jesus is the fulfillment of that. And it's like, I'm not saying that's not fulfilled. I believe that. But when you start arguing your dispensational ideas, it's like, if it's true that the interpretation that he's going to deal with the Jews again, that means he's bringing the temple back for the Jews, then they're still like kind of in the Mosaic covenant. Some of them teach that. And it's like that. What is that but an outright denial that the church was Jewish? If you think the new temple's going to come back, you can't say the temple's coming back and I'm replacement theology and argue with me about doctrine and say I'm trying to put you under the law of Moses. The only way that the law of Moses is done away with for you, dear friend, is if the new covenant has been brought for the Jews in the first century. Otherwise, the Mosaic covenant for the Jews is still active, then there is no new covenant because the new covenant was for them. So either the church is the new covenant for the Jews, and so you don't have to keep those certain laws under the laws of Moses. And the only reason you wouldn't have to be part of God's people is because the new covenant has come and the old covenant's gone. So you're not bringing back the temple for the Jews. And then also you're one of God's people who doesn't have to keep any of the laws because they're done away with because it was a schoolmaster for us. And Jesus did away with it because it was a schoolmaster to bring us to the what? The what? The new covenant where the law is written on your heart because the old covenant's ratified. Yeah, that's the Jewish thing. If that's going to come back, then there's no new covenant yet. So there was a schoolmaster for us. And now it's done away with in the sacrifice of Jesus. Okay, that doesn't work that way. Sorry. Your mind is compartmentalized in such a way that you just don't even know what you're talking about. You're just nonsense.